In the world of literature, one of the most crucial aspects that differentiates a well-received story from a poorly received story is how effectively the author executes their ideas. While themes, plots, and characters can be compelling in their own conceptual form, the success of a work largely hinges on how well these concepts are communicated, explored, and developed. And this exists in every field. We all know it simply as the execution of an idea. And so what this video is about is the troubles that come with, or rather the difficulty that comes with, critiquing these executions of ideas in storytelling. As I hope you all know this, but what's good for one person could be terrible for another person, and what's terrible for one person could be good for another, masterful, really, for another reader entirely. And because this video is about the complexities of judging these stories and the execution, I'll just get the obvious out of the way, which is what all people can call bad execution out the gate. And that is in the scenario where it is clear, and clear meaning that perhaps you have the author actually telling you this, that maybe the story is about redemption, but then what happens is that the protagonist is killing all the villains, and the context of the killing is to not even conversate with these villains or antagonists. It's not even symbolic, but it's simply ruthless, and there is no POV that points towards the antagonist or the villain's redemption or attempt of a redemption. And so in that case, you can look at the author and just tell them to their face that they have failed in their endeavor, because there's nothing in the story that points to what they just told you that it is about. So now that we have the very obvious example out of the way, and if you want a very quick definition of what I mean by execution, I mean execution to me refers to how well an author can translate their abstract ideas into tangible narrative elements. And so that means how the character or the story conveys through the actions, the dialogue, the world building, and the pacing, and how all of that comes together to explore that story's themes and ideas. And so if we go back to the example of redemption, we can say that in its conceptual form, this theme is broad and timeless, and is found in many works of the past, literary works of the past, and surely will be found in many more literary works in the future. But what you'll see is that every author approaches the execution of this theme in dramatically different ways. So for example, some might take a slow introspective character arc where the protagonist, if the protagonist is the one that needs redeeming, earns their redemption through small humanizing acts. Of course, this also can be applied to any other character, whether it's the villain, side character, the antagonist, all that. But then on the other hand, you have authors that might go for a more dramatic approach where the protagonist is redeemed through a single grandiose act of sacrifice or bravery. And so of course I want to use popular examples that the majority of you would know, hopefully. An example of the slow introspective is maybe Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, and an example of the fast and grandiose manner would be Darth Vader from Star Wars, Anakin Skywalker. And then you have examples of the in-betweens where you can't say it was very fast, but you can't say it was very slow in execution. An example of this would be Byakuya Kuchiki from Bleach. And even his redemption is more of like a unique cases where it's not necessarily the point of his character completely, but it's to say that it's an aspect of his character, and it's directed towards one singular character, which would be Rukia. And if we're talking about special, or we could say different executions of redemption, you could also add in Rudius Grey Rat from Jobless Reincarnation, or Mushoku Tensei. I hope that's the right show, where what he's redeeming for is the life he lived, so to speak, and that he might be considered a redemption, a self-redemption, where now he's living the life that he should have lived, so to speak. But not to get too distracted by examples, but the point that I'm trying to make is that the goal of these different types of executions of redemption is the emotional resonance with the audience. And when we're talking about techniques used to execute this would mean that the story itself has intellectual depth. So this means that you not only conveyed the redemption and made sense of it through emotions of the characters that is conveyed to the audience, but it's also through maybe world building, or maybe only through writing techniques like world building, where maybe the audience doesn't feel that the character deserves to be forgiven or redeemed, but through the mechanics of the story, such as the world building, it makes sense for the characters in that setting, in that story, to allow for said character's redemption. And you could say an example of this would be Son Goku, where he tells Krillin to spare Vegeta and let him escape. And you can make the argument that the reason why Krillin even listened to him, even though Vegeta is maybe not directly but still connected to many deaths of people, is because Goku is pure of heart can sense evil key, and so maybe he should be listened to in this situation. And so with these examples, you know that the process of execution for an author revolves around their choices regarding style, pacing, character development, narrative structure, thematic focus, and of course all these elements coming together and working harmoniously in the story that has been crafted. And so while it might seem very straightforward to judge these stories and authors on whether or not they executed the idea correctly, in reality this is a much more complex issue, because readers themselves, and not just critics, bring their own personal preferences, experiences, and biases into reading when they're reading a story. And of course that greatly affects how they perceive the execution of a story. And so knowing that what constitutes as a good execution is highly subjective, that could work for one reader and fail for another. And using the examples I've stated before, one major area of execution when it comes to story redemption is pacing and narrative structure, which is highly subjective, because some readers can enjoy a slow burn story that takes time to build its characters and themes in depth, while others can find it very tedious and overly drawn out. And this doesn't even get into the topic of the situations that the authors were in when writing their stories, which is actually quite important to judging the final product. An example of this would be if it's a weekly story, as I found out about Weekly Shonen Jump, that if your sales are dependent on the weekly releases or maybe the volumes, you can't afford to drag down the story for the audience and give 100 chapters solely to the execution of a redemption arc of a villain, as that is basically almost 2 years of focusing on a character, and maybe you're not on the wider story if the story isn't about redemption. And of course this also includes the concept of how is that author executing this. So it could be that they're following that one character for those 100 chapters, or they could be bouncing around characters like Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire, where they're bouncing around the POVs. But the essence of my point still stands, that because of the outside factors of the publication or whatever personal life things that might be happening, it does affect the final product, and we also should take that into account. And this goes back to the narrative structure and pacing of a story about redemption, where I've already said that pacing wise, some people might like it fast and some people might like it slow. But then narrative structure wise, you can find stories that handle this through non-linear story timelines. For example, flashbacks or just fragmented storytelling. And that in itself can be polarizing to readers, as it adds another level of intellectual challenge into piecing together this story and the disjointed narratives. And so while some people may love this, as maybe it feels more organic or something to that nature, others may view it as unnecessary complexity that hinders their enjoyment of the story. Emotional engagement is another aspect of execution that's filled with subjectivity, as it's usually put through with character development, where if you are redeeming a character, instead of them becoming good in a faster paced way, or rather not a fast-paced way, but rather they don't become conventionally good, so to speak, but they are more morally ambiguous and are deeply flawed throughout their journey of redemption, where others can find this as richly complex and realistic. Of course, realism having to be tied towards the story itself and not reality. And of course, if we're saying character development, I would say that what if we leave the character from going from being evil to being morally ambiguous, and that was their redemption path. That's where it goes and that's where it ends. And so once again, you will have the crowd that will say that that is richly complex, and on the other hand, you'll have the crowd that will say that this character still ended up being unlikable and underdeveloped, even though these are very subjective takes. As you can say that if you say that the character is unlikable, you say that, oh, this character is to be redeemed, and then someone says that they are still unlikable, you could just say that the assumption is that a character that is redeemed is likable now, which doesn't have to be the case. So you can truly have a character that's dogmatic, dictatorial, and just overall annoying, and he was evil, but then turn into a character that's good, who is dogmatic, dictatorial, and annoying, but he does it for the good side. And so that's how subjectivity in the critique of execution can be subjective, depending on the emotional engagement and the character development of the character. And the final area of subjectivity that I can, when it comes to critique in execution, that I can name in this video, would be the very concept of the exploration and the depth of that exploration. And that would be through dialogue and tropes, where depending on the dialogue or the trope that is used, for one reader, the story could be profound and very moving, while for another, it could be melodramatic and cliche. And it's important to know that the difference in response stems from the reader's own familiarity with the preference for those themes. So they're familiar with the trope and they're familiar with the dialogue, or they just find the dialogue overly cliche. And I think a great example of this is the concept of a character, for the sake of redemption, giving their lives up for a greater cause. So essentially self-sacrifice. And so on one hand, I think it's important to say that we all can know to a certain degree how it must feel like to feel that you're watching the same story but played differently. So that's talking to the people who believe in, the cliches and the anti-use of tropes in a general sense. I would say what's more important is how the author goes about using said trope and how it fits into their story, rather than the fact that it is being used. But then on top of that, we can also talk about how the author can't account for your knowledge of a trope or your knowledge of certain dialogue and how you would feel about it. And so with knowing that, you can say that self-sacrifice might be something that you're familiar with and you might know, but can't really try to extend it and say that the execution is bad for it, because that means you're judging the story based off of your own history, which the author cannot account for because they cannot read your mind. And so with all this knowledge, I hope it's also very clear how difficult universal critique actually is, especially when it comes to the concept of execution, as a lot of the critique will be inherently subjective. And I would say the goal of this video was to show you that there are few universal metrics by which you can measure the success of execution. Because again, what resonates and what makes sense to one reader can change for another, which makes it naturally difficult to apply broad objective standards when evaluating a story's execution. And so this ultimately means that critics and readers alike must recognize their opinions of a story's execution is shaped by their individual tastes, experiences, and expectations. Of course, the subjectivity does not mean that critique is futile, but tells us that the nature of critique has to be divorced from our personal experiences and individual tastes. And hopefully we will both discover this through the progression of this channel. And with that, I end this video.